Howdy, all of you delicious people. We are here today to review Hulk versus. We end up having two movies in one, basically, or in some cases separately, where, because it depends on how you buy them and how you get them and how you whatever. Uh, we end up having two stories to be told here, let's just say. We have ultimately Hulk versus Wolverine, and we have Hulk versus Thor. Ultimately, we have basically Hulk plopped in a in an atmosphere that is not quite Hulk related, but is of supporting character related. We end up having it to where in one story, we end up having it to where Hulk is dropped into Canada, and in another story, we end up having it to where Hulk is ultimately dipped into Asgard. Um, so by and large, we ultimately have two stories in two heroes, basically home environments, let's just say. So, if anything, I think I honestly like the Hulk versus Wolverine story just a little bit better. I think there is much more interesting comedy there, and plus also you have Deadpool that is a really good, uh, hilarious character, as well as Sabretooth, Lady Deathstrike, and really just Weapon X. Because we end up having it to where we really dip into Wolverine's origin story within this story. And we end up having it to where ultimately in the uh, Hulk versus Thor, we ultimately have it to where there's a much more interesting story going on there with really not only Hulk, but basically a ton of the Asgardians, which will make for a very interesting story with Enchantress, Loki, Odin, and pretty much all of the just all of the Asgardians whatsoever. We really have it to where there's an interesting approach that I'm not familiar with of Asgard in this story. Because ultimately, I guess I just haven't really read enough of Thor, because ultimately I just tend to just read other books. There's sometimes where I just want to kind of dive in every once in a while, maybe read a book of Thor or kind of get some kind of backstory of the character a little bit more through books. But because ultimately, like the Jane Foster Thor was pretty interesting to me. So going into here, we end up having uh, oops. Okay. We end up having really two interesting stories that are basically like fight it out kind of things, and then wait for more story to be had. So, speaking of which, let's fight on and ultimately go into reviewing both these stories. Because reasonably, there is not much time for me to be able to stretch with either one of these things going on here, or otherwise, I'd be telling so much of the not only story or whatever. There's a very hard amount of time to ultimately talk about this cryptically with a 30-minute movie. So let's ultimately go into that double five timed territory to ultimately go into spoilers about each one of these movies because they are separate. Ultimately, I guess I could have gone and done like Hulk versus Wolverine and Hulk versus Thor like separately on here, but I think what I'll just end up doing is I'll review Hulk versus Wolverine and then go and just do Hulk versus Thor. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So Hulk versus Wolverine. So we seemingly end up having it to where Wolverine is seemingly dropped from out of the sky somewhere onto a ground where ultimately he has gotten his arm stuck, and he ultimately needs to get his arm out of where it is stuck, and eventually he is like, God, where am I? And then we end up having it to ultimately Hulk is to come into frame, and we have it to where Wolverine's like, oh yeah. So we end up having to show previous time before this, where uh, we have it to where we're showing the lead up to here. We end up finding out that Hulk had come to Canada and seemingly had annihilated some of this town, and so the military is sending in Wolverine to take this thing down. We ultimately have it to where we, of course, have to showcase that this is Canada, because we end up having it to where the general that is otherwise guiding Logan through this is ultimately saying like, the Americans call it the Hulk. So we end up having it to where Wolverine is to be shot out to go after the Hulk, and we end up having it to where uh, reasonably the Wolverine is having or the Wolverine is having trouble finding the Hulk, and so he ends up stumbling upon a man that is consistently crying, "Ooh, I'm crying, Wolverine! Look at me, tears of the crying, all up in this BI." And so we end up having it to where Wolverine grabs this guy, because ultimately we end up having it to where Wolverine had smelled the scent of Hulk before, and ultimately it had smelled toxic, I guess. So we have it to where ultimately Wolverine is to ultimately ask, like, hey, you see anybody big green? Like, hey, like, I haven't seen anybody in I don't know how long, and it looks like, what are you doing here, Weepy? Because we end up having to our Hulk as Banner in this story is just really a boo-hooish guy that really Logan is just kind of just slapping around a lot of the times, because reasonably like Banner is like a non-existent entity in here, where like we have to get Hulk out. So anyways, so we end up having it to where ultimately Logan is to ask uh, Banner, like, hey, Weepy, like, where's the big green guy? Have you seen him? And so we end up having it to where Wolverine ends up taking a big old whiff of Banner and ultimately says like, you smell toxic. So we end up having it to where reasonably that Wolverine is not taking this lightly and pushing this guy against a tree of sorts or something along those lines to ultimately have claws to uh, like both ends of claws are to separate between the guy's face, and eventually we end up having into where Wolverine is to torture this guy for information of like, why do you smell toxic? And if you aren't going to say anything, there's going to be a third claw that's going to come out. So we end up having it to where Bruce is like, please stop, please don't, please whatever. And we end up having it to where ultimately Bruce, of course, gets angry, and of course, that anger or that fear ends up turning into the Hulk, to where ultimately we have it to where Wolverine really underestimates this guy's size, and he gets freaking knocked back. We end up having it where now we have the very first scene that we approached in here, and ultimately we have Hulk. We ultimately have Wolverine that's going, "Oh yeah," and then like it repeats back all over to ultimately show current time. So we end up having it to where ultimately Wolverine is basically asking for like, okay, well, round two. So we end up having it at some points where ultimately it seems that Wolverine is going to get his licks in with Hulk kind of like slashing him onto the back, or ultimately going in and trying to like stab him as much as humanly possible. But it reasonably, a lot of times we end up having it to where Hulk ends up just either completely bashing in repetitiously Wolverine's skull, or any number of things, ultimately saying, "I'm strong as the words." Ah, and so we end up having it to where these guys are slugging it out and repetitiously fighting it out, to where ultimately we end up finding that there is the Weapon X there to ultimately go and shoot down and tranquilize both Hulk and Wolverine. Where ultimately we have Deadpool ultimately mentioning, "Hey Wolverine, I shot you." So we end up having it to where the Grandmaster plan of Weapon X is to ultimately go and erase both Wolverine and Hulk's memory, so they are to use them as Weapon X. And so seemingly like that is always, I guess, the game plan of Weapon X is to always erase everyone's memory. I don't always get what that is, but it is what it is. So we end up having to showcase eventually Wolverine's origin, where we are to showcase that he had gone to a bar somewhere, and ultimately Stryker had ended up kind of kidnapping him, taking him, taking him to, I guess, their island of sorts, and experimenting on him, which ultimately gave him the adamantium claws, and ultimately we had it to where Wolverine was to start working with Weapon X, and ultimately Sabretooth says, "Yeah, you know what? I don't think that this guy's going to work out. Like, I know this kind of guy, and it's just not going to work out." And so we end up having to where Wolverine slowly but surely ends up having like a common sense mind of his own, and eventually he ends up fleeing from Weapon X to ultimately do his own thing. So we end up having it to where ultimately Wolverine is seemingly uh, bound and tied up, and to where ultimately Deadpool is to come in and ultimately say, "Hey Wolverine, like I missed you. Nobody calls me Bub anymore." Like it ultimately, so Wolverine, so Deadpool is kind of like uh, mentioning about every single like supporting character that are in here, um, like basically mentioning how Lady Deathstrike really, really wanted to kill Wolverine. Ultimately, of course, uh, uh, Deadpool also mentions that Omega Red is a bedwetter and all kinds of things. So we eventually push on to ultimately have it to where Stryker is to go and give us the game plan of what they are going to do with Wolverine and what they are going to do with the Hulk, which ultimately is going to erase their memories and make them work for them, is basically the Grandmaster plan. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that uh, in the process of Wolverine eventually getting his mind wiped, which I would have assumed, we end up having it to where eventually Sabretooth and Lady Deathstrike just outpower Stryker by Sabretooth stabbing uh, getting stabbed in the back, or stabbing Stryker in the back, and ultimately going and trying to kill Wolverine, because they're like, "Dude, like, I just want to kill this guy. I don't want to work with him. I want to kill him instead." So we end up having it to where eventually that Wolverine is to escape from this cell, from this medical or uh, tube-like cell that he is stuck in, and he is to run off to try and find Banner, which ultimately he seemingly is very hurt, and ultimately he is seemingly medicated, and so we end up having it to where because Banner is not quite Banner yet, we end up having it to where Wolverine has to try and take down these Weapon X individuals, and ultimately he does that by, of course, being Wolverine. But then eventually because ultimately we end up having it to where we end up having Deadpool and Omega Red reconnect with the other Weapon X characters. And I'm like, hey, what happened to Stryker? And ultimately, uh, Sabretooth said Wolverine killed him, and Deadpool said like, well, I'm sure Stryker's last words were, Sabretooth. So basically saying that it's like, yeah, I know you killed him, but whatever. So we end up having it to where Weapon X strikes a pose and goes off to go and kill Wolverine. Wolverine ends up going and telling him, like, dude, you're not going to take me down because two words, snicked, snicked. So we end up having it to where Wolverine ends up trying to fight off Weapon X, but really what ends up happening is Omega Red ends up capturing Wolverine with his bizarrish, like, electrical tentacle things that ultimately he has upon his arms, and so we end up having to where Wolverine is getting electrified, and so we end up having it to where ultimately, while that is to go on, we end up having it to where also Wolverine had stabbed Hulk to ultimately make it so that he is not or he will overcome his medication to make him Hulk again. And so we eventually have it to where Hulk is basically tearing people apart, basically ripping Lady Deathstrike's arms off, and basically like hitting Sabretooth so hard he goes flying, and basically just ripping and tearing every little character to the point of them not being able to do the thing that they're known for. So we end up having it to ultimately Deadpool is trying to go and take down the Hulk by because ultimately he had lost his arm via Logan, and so he ends up trying to reattach it. So we end up having it to where Deadpool ultimately goes and puts a bomb in Hulk's mouth, and then Wolverine and Deadpool are running in front of the Hulk because Hulk is even attacking Wolverine because he doesn't care. It's just a person in the way. And so because we end up having Hulk attacking Wolverine, and ultimately Wolverine is like, dude, I'm on your side, you flaming idiot. So we end up having it to where Deadpool puts a bomb in Hulk's mouth, and the bomb goes off, but that doesn't do anything to the Hulk, it just annoys him. So we end up having it to where Hulk ultimately uh, is to want to kill the talking man. And ultimately, like, uh, Wolverine is just like, oh, well, hey, here you go. So we end up having it uh, to where Wolverine tosses Deadpool to Hulk, and Hulk takes him and beats the living crap out of him. So we eventually have it to where every single Weapon X character is eventually just annihilated, and we eventually have it to where Hulk goes out of his way to uh, try and destroy this entire Weapon X facility and smash it to the ground. And so eventually we have it to where Hulk ends up grabbing a device uh, where Wolverine is going to think that uh, he is going to take down the entire building with this huge device of sorts, but instead uh, Hulk ends up taking this device and smacking Wolverine with it, which ultimately takes him flying way out of the facility to ultimately have it to where Hulk ends up destroying this entire facility and then flying out of it to ultimately have it to where Hulk and Wolverine are going into round two. And that's how the movie ends. So now we have it to where it's Hulk versus Thor. So we end up having it to where reasonably in this movie, we end up having the Enchantress ultimately going and with the Executioner going and rescuing Loki from prison. Because we end up finding out that, one, uh, Thor is going and trying to protect Asgard from attackers to try and save Asgard. Because evidently Asgard is consistently on attack, so they have to kind of keep hold of everything, and or otherwise, if they lose Asgard, they basically lose this realm. Like it's basically a consistent fight out of realms uh, to ultimately kind of keep what they have. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Loki is to be put into prison, and so we have it to where seemingly that the Enchantress is going to find where Loki's prison is and ultimately get him to uh, like tell them what their Grandmaster's scheme is. Where we have it to where Loki ultimately had grabbed Banner and is now going to separate Banner from the Hulk, and we end up having it to where. Let me pause here for a second. All right, so we have Asgard, and it is consistently being attacked, and so we ultimately have Loki, who is going with Enchantress to go and seemingly separate Thor from, uh, or separate Hulk from Banner. And so we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Banner and Hulk are being separated by Enchantress, and we end up having it to where Loki is controlling Hulk to go to Asgard and attack all the Asgardians. All while we eventually have it to where Banner is going to end up being killed, uh, because basically Loki is tired of hearing of Banner's whining about like this is a mistake, don't do this, you can't control it, so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Banner is to be killed to ultimately have him go to Hela to be in her place, her realm, her uh, underworld of sorts or whatever. So we end up having it to where reasonably, uh, so Hulk is to just bash through all of Asgard, and we end up having it to where Thor tries to go and take on Hulk, uh, not realizing that like ultimately calling the Hulk like an ogre and all kinds of things, and because ultimately that's normal stuff. So we end up having it to where eventually that, of course, we have Hulk who ends up just bashing the crap out of Thor to the point of horror. Thor basically being dead, being killed, and we end up having it to where Enchantress ultimately is like, "Oh my god, like I didn't think it would go this far." So ultimately, like I am going to try and revive. I'm going to try to revive Thor by kissing him, and so because ultimately we end up having it to where uh, Thor is fighting Hulk and realizing that it's actually Loki inside Hulk. And so we end up having like the best of two worlds where we end up having it where Thor is in or Loki is inside a Hulk, and so he knows all of their strategies and all their weaknesses and whatever. So we end up having it to where ultimately because we have it to where Asgard, we end up having it to where Odin is going to do, of course, Odin's sleep, and uh, we end up having it to where Thor has a little bit of conversation with some of the kind of side characters and stuff along those lines. But when eventually we have it to where Thor is to kiss Enchantress, Enchantress is to be asked by Thor, okay, where is Loki? You know where he is. So we end up having it to where Enchantress tells exactly where Loki is. Thor ends up going after him and ultimately ends up taking him down. But the only problem is now Hulk is still running amok on Asgard, and so we end up having it to where Thor ultimately has to ask Loki, well, hey, where is Banner? So we end up having it to where they have to go to Hela to ultimately go and collect Banner. Because recently the bargain for Hela is that ultimately Banner, yes, is dead, but ultimately he's only half of a soul. Banner has to be reconnected with the Hulk to complete one soul. So, because we end up having to where Banner is ultimately seemingly having an afterlife of being with Betty Ross and ultimately having a kid and ultimately having a really good life. So, we end up having it where Thor is to come and collect is to come to collect Banner, ultimately grab him, and eventually magically take and fuse Banner and Hulk back together, and ultimately take down Loki and call it a day. So that is towards the end of that story, and recently I thought, like, all together, mixing both of these stories together, like a lot of them were like kind of the Thor story to me. I'm like, nah, like I don't really like. I liked most of the story. It's just I didn't really care for like the uh like kind of the Hela part and kind of the ending half of the movie. I didn't really care for it. So other than that, I am going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.